Good evening and welcome to an author talk with Ken Haigh. My name is Emma Barker and I am the manager of public services at the Blue Mountains Public Library in Thornbury, Ontario, the town of the Blue Mountains. And tonight I am thrilled to welcome Ken Haigh, author of On Foot to Canterbury, A Son's Pilgrimage. Ken has also written another book that was published, Under the Holy Lake, which was about his travels in Bhutan. Ken is from Clarksburg, Ontario, so he is as local as it gets. I was very excited this year when I read on CBC that Ken had been nominated for the 2021 Hillary Weston Writers' Trust Prize for Nonfiction. Such an honor, and we are so proud of you, Ken, for being nominated. On Foot to Canterbury, A Son's Pilgrimage is a nonfiction tale. Ken is going to talk about it tonight, about the inspiration, about the travel. And I just wanted to let everyone know that it is available to borrow at the Blue Mountains Public Library, but it is also available to purchase at Jessica's Book Nook. Ken, I wanted to welcome you and let's get started. Okay, great. So Ken, welcome. And I wanted everyone to know who wasn't aware that Ken was the first CEO at the Ellie Shore Library. And today, December 2nd, is actually the 26th anniversary of the Ellie Shore Library. And Ken, I was hoping before we dive into the book, if you could talk a little bit about what it was like in 1995 when the library opened and what it was like being CEO.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I had kind of a strange peripatetic sort of back growing up, and I started my working life as a teacher. I taught in Bhutan and then China and then the Canadian Arctic. And then I moved back to Southern Ontario looking for a job, and there just weren't any at the time. It was a really bad time to be a teacher. And I was talking to a friend of mine who was a librarian, and he says, why don't you become a librarian? There's lots of library jobs. So I did. I went back to school. I went to Western and got my MLS. And just before I graduated, I was starting to look around for a job, and I saw the one advertised in Thornbury. It was advertised as a brand new state-of-the-art library. So I got quite excited about that because I knew the area, and I thought, what a beautiful place to live. But I thought I better come early and just have a look at this new library before I go into my interview, just so I'm really well prepared. So I drove up to Thornbury and I drove around Thornbury, and Thornbury's not that big. And I went around about 3 times looking for this brand new state-of-the-art library. And it was about the 3rd time that I passed this building site that I realized this big hole in the ground was the new state-of-the-art Ellie Shore Library, but it wasn't built yet. So that was a bit of a shock. But it actually turned out in the end to be a good thing because my first office was in the old Clarksburg School, which was where the township offices were at that time. So I got to sit and work with everybody who worked for the township of Collingwood before we became amalgamated, before we became Town of Blue Mountains. So back then it was still Thornbury, Collingwood Township, but there was a real desire for a union library, and there had been for many years, but they just couldn't afford it until the Shore Foundation stepped in and donated that $1.5 million. And so a new state-of-the-art facility was built. I was fortunate to be the first CEO. We didn't use the word CEO back then, though, Emma. It seemed a little pretentious. I was the chief librarian or the head librarian. And it was great because it was a brand new building. I was the only full-time employee. The 2 librarians from the Thornbury and Clarksburg libraries joined as well. And they that was Anita and Lynn, and they were part-time. So between the 3 of us, we really had 2 full-time positions. So it's really changed over the years because now you guys are open 7 days a week. Back then, we were really struggling to keep it open 5 days a week, but we had lots of really good volunteers that were helping as well. But as I said, it was great for me because I had to do everything. We had to design job descriptions, policies. We had to buy computer software. We had to mark records because there'd been no computerized records at the time. We set up the first internet connection, the first website. We scanned a bunch of old historical photographs and put them on the website. So we were doing everything for the first time, and it was really, really exciting. And I have to say that I was really, really fortunate too in the library board that hired me because they were amazing. And I didn't realize it at the time because it was my first job. So I didn't realize just how lucky I was because I had a really wonderful library board. They were really, really supportive. They were really excited about the new facility and the possibilities of the new facility. they never micromanaged me. They basically just said to me, Ken, what do you need? And then they would get it for me. So it was great. I remember Peter Morrow was on the library board, and he was driving me around town, introducing me to people. And we went down into Thornbury, and I got out of the car and I went to lock his car door because he was the one driving. And he said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm locking the door. He says, nobody locks the door in Thornbury. So I was really embarrassed, but I realized he was right. But that sort of came to backfire on me later, because if you think about the Ellie Shore Library, the book drop that the architects designed was on the sidewalk side of the building, because they thought everybody would be walking to the library. They didn't really think that we serve quite a wide population, that many of the people drive to the library. So a lot of people were coming to the library with their books after hours, and they didn't want to walk all the way around the building to put it in the book drop. So what they ended up doing was just putting them on the front seat of my car. So for about the first year, I had a great big Chevy or classic Malibu. It's like they used to make taxis out of these cars, the big bench seats. And I'd get out at the end of the day, I'd be really tired. All the lights are turned off, the computers are turned off. I get out to my car, open the door, and the front seat would be full of books. So one of the first things we fundraised for was that book drop you find off the parking lot now, the freestanding one, because I realized I can't keep using my car as a book drop. So, that was just the other weird thing we discovered when we first opened was that if you didn't get up and shovel off the roof in the winter, and if the snow got too high, all the heating units would turn off. So one of my jobs not only was to be the librarian, but when we had a big snowstorm was to get the ladder out and go up on the roof and shovel all the snow off so that the heat wouldn't turn off in the building. So I think the town does that for us now, but back then that was my job. Yeah. So lots of things to learn, and a really exciting time to be the librarian, for sure.
That's amazing. I just have a couple of photos I was going to share, because hopefully you guys can all see this and it's okay. But this was in the Toronto Star, published about how, and there is a story behind this. It is on our website for anyone who doesn't know that the Ellie Shore Foundation, they donated the money for the building, but that the community had to come together to fill it. And this Toronto Star article is so interesting, and I am going to share it on our Facebook page later. So please take a look at that, because it's just such a great story, and to think of how far we have come from 1995 to now. And then I also have this amazing photo of Ken and the Coin and Stamp Club with the library. And this is just classic Ken with the 80s, 90s mustache. And I just love this photo. Yeah. And then just one more shot of like how gorgeous is our library. I'm so thrilled with this branch and how far it's come now, and just that we have another branch at the Craigley Depot, and there's a gallery, a museum, archives. There's just a lot. So just happy anniversary to Ellie Shore. And I just think that is so wonderful. Yeah. And that being said, Ken, now we can focus back on your award nominated book. And I know you have a slideshow for us, so I am going to just hand this over to you.
Okay, thanks, Emma. So the book, as Emma said, is called On Foot to Canterbury. It was published this year, and I was fortunate in that it was nominated for the Hurley Weston Writers Trust Nonfiction Award, which I didn't win, by the way, but it was a real honor to be on that list. And the book that did win, Thompson Highway's memoir, is an amazing book. So I would highly recommend you read that book, and it certainly deserved the win. I just felt honored to be up there. And that was a bit of a surprise, because I remember the morning they made the announcement, I was sitting down for breakfast, and my wife bought me this little tablet, and I was checking my email, and I saw the subject line said, Hillary Weston finalists. And I thought, oh, I wonder who's on the list this year. And I clicked on it, scrolling down the list, and I saw my book there. And my first thought was, oh, somebody's playing a joke on me. But then other emails started coming in from people I knew saying, congratulations, congratulations. So it was very, very exciting. All right, so I'll talk a bit about the book itself. So this is the path that I walked on, that I wrote the book about. So it's called The Pilgrim's Way. It goes from Winchester to Canterbury, and it basically follows the route that pilgrims would have followed in the Middle Ages, who were going to Canterbury to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. And in the late Middle Ages, there were three really popular shrines in Europe for pilgrimage. The most popular, of course, was Rome, followed by Santiago de Compostela, and the third most popular, surprisingly, was Canterbury. So people were coming from all over Europe to visit the shrine there. But if you were walking from the west of England, people felt this was the route you would have taken. Or if you were coming from France and you'd sailed to Southampton, you would have landed down below there and you would have walked up to Winchester and then across. That was the shortest way to Canterbury. The path follows an escarpment called the North Downs. It's a chalk escarpment. And in a way, it's very similar to the Niagara Escarpment. It's this raised ridge of land. It's very green because it wasn't really good farmland and there wasn't enough water up there to support a town. So throughout history, it just remained this sort of green corridor that goes through some of the most densely populated parts of England, but always feels very rural. So it was a beautiful walk. And there was a writer back in the early 1900s, Hilaire Belloc, who traced this route. He was the first one to sort of actively retrace this medieval pilgrimage route. And he guessed that it was actually a much older walk than that it had actually been around since the Stone Age. He felt some of the first people who crossed to Britain from the continent probably followed this path to move into England. So he called it the Old Road rather than the Pilgrim's Way. But as I said, it follows this chalk escarpment. It was a very old road, but in modern times it sort of fell into disuse. But it has been reborn as a walking path, so it's become a popular walking path. Most people do it in day trips, like we do on the Bruce Trail. They might take the train from London and walk from one station to another, and then go back and just do it for the day and end up doing the whole thing that way. But it took me 14 days to do the whole thing, and the towns you see along here with the circles, that's where I stayed overnight. The reason for doing the trip was it was something I was going to do with my father. And I think rather than just talk and talk, I'll read a little bit from the book where I explain that. The pilgrimage from Winchester to Canterbury along the Pilgrim's Way had been my idea, something to do with my father to mark his retirement. This was the traditional route followed by medieval pilgrims to the shrine of the murdered Archbishop St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. I knew the idea would appeal to him. He was an active member of his local Anglican church, and Canterbury Cathedral, our destination, was the mothership of the global Anglican communion. My father was also a keen outdoorsman. He loved to walk. It was from him that I learned to pitch a tent, build a fire, clean a fish, and paddle a canoe. But fate intervened. Within weeks of my broaching the subject, my father was dead of a massive heart attack. He died on a Sunday morning while assisting a disabled parishioner with the elevator in the parish hall. One moment he was laughing and closing the elevator door behind him. The next moment he was dead. His heart had simply exploded. So the idea of walking to Canterbury was put on a shelf, but never quite forgotten. Many years passed, and then in the spring of 2014, I began to reconsider the notion. Perhaps it was because I was finding life a bit overwhelming. I missed my old man, and I could have used his advice. I also sensed that I was approaching a midlife crisis with all the cliched existential anguish it implied. I felt trapped in a job I did not enjoy, and my life lacked any meaningful purpose. I knew I had to do something or spontaneously combust. Go, my wife said. You've been thinking about doing this for 10 years. But my father is dead. What would be the point now? Then do it for your father, she said gently. Go. The kids and I will be fine. So that's how the walk started. And here's where it starts. So this is Winchester Cathedral, which is the longest Gothic cathedral in Europe. So it's a very big example of Gothic. It's really beautiful inside. It's a little plain on the outside, but it is really a remarkable example of Gothic architecture, which happens to be my favorite period. And I discovered just serendipitously that it's also the burial place of two famous English authors. I'm an English major. That's what I studied in university. So I got very excited when I'm walking across England to discover all of the literary associations of the places that I was walking through. So the two people who were buried here, in the center panel, you can see a stained glass window representing Sir Isaac Walton. And he wrote The Complete Angler, and it was published in 1653. It's one of my favorite books. It's kind of a compendium of everything everybody thought about how to go fishing, but it was also a lot more. There's a lot of lovely little asides, and that's supposed to be Walton sitting there by the river and with his fishing tackle reading a book. So I was very pleased to discover his tomb in the cathedral. The other famous person who's buried in Winchester Cathedral is Jane Austen. She lived the last months of her life in Winchester, and she was buried here right in the floor of the nave. And you can see her tombstone there laid down. Lots of people stop here for selfies. And I would bump into Jane Austen again and again on my walk. So it was kind of serendipitous that I would meet her here on my first day. That's the interior of Winchester Cathedral. As you can see, it's quite beautiful. And Winchester itself had its own saint. So most people were heading to Canterbury, where St. Thomas Becket was buried, but Winchester also had a saint called St. Swithin, and he was an early Anglo-Saxon bishop renowned for his piety and his humility. And there's an interesting story about St. Swithin. When he died, he asked that he be buried outside the cathedral, in the grounds, so that the rain could fall on his grave, because he was a very humble man. But as the cathedral grew over the years, they decided to move his body inside and build a shrine over it. Well, the story is that St. Swithin was so upset by this that he caused it to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. So in England, they have a folk saying, so on July 15th, if it rains, you will have 40 days more of rain. And there's a little rhyme that goes with it, which I'll read you. St. Swithin's day, if thou dost rain, for 40 days it will remain. St. Swithin's day, if thou be fair, for 40 days 'twill rain nae mair. So it's kind of like our Groundhog Day. So on July 15th in Southern England, if it rains, you're in for a wet summer. I threw this in just to show you what the path was like. These are bluebells. I was walking in May, so it's everything was in bloom at that time. Bluebells carpet the forests in Southern England, much the way trilliums do around here. So it was really quite pretty. And this is an example of the sort of trail I would be walking. The old Pilgrim's Way, parts of it are gone, but what they've done is they've parceled together cart tracks, farm roads, bridle paths, rights of way across fields, and they sort of reassembled the whole trail for you to walk. And every night I would spend in a small town. This is New Elsford. It was where I spent the first night. You can see it's quite a pleasant little town. And every town had its church, usually a Norman church, but sometimes even an Anglo-Saxon church. This one is I think it's, let me just see, St. Nicholas's Church in Bishop Sutton. And I included it because I love the lintel over the door. So some Norman stone carver had a sense of humor. So he's created these strange bird-like figures, and you can see they're all sort of gnawing along on the top of the door frame. I thought that was a really nice detail. And as I said, I would keep bumping into Jane Austen on this trip. This is the little village of Chawton, and this is where Jane Austen lived for the later part of her life. And there's an interesting story about this house too. Jane had a brother named Edward, and the Austens had cousins named the Knights who were actually really well off. They owned two very large estates, but the Knights were childless. They didn't have any heirs. So they approached the Austen family and they said, we'd like to adopt Edward as our heir. The only catch is he'll have to change his last name to Knight. So Jane's mom and dad thought it over and said, sounds like a good deal for Edward. So they agreed. And when he came into his inheritance, this building on the estate in Chawton was standing empty. So he moved his widowed mother and his two sisters into this building with a couple of servants. And they were quite happy here, I think. Jane was certainly very productive. She'd already written Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, but she revised it here and she sent it off to be published. And then she wrote all of her other books here. And it wasn't until like the last, I think, 8 months of her life that she fell ill and she moved into Winchester to be closer to doctors and things. And that's where she died. So this house today is a museum. So if you're a big Jane Austen fan, it's really worth a visit. I would recommend it. Another famous writer along the route was a man named William Cobbett. He was born in a little village called Farnham, where I stayed. And he was born in this pub, actually. I think it was called the Jolly Farmer when he was alive. Now it's called William Cobbett, kind of because he became famous. But his father was the publican here. And Cobbett went on to become a famous radical journalist. He even started his own newspaper called the Political Register. And the reason I was interested in Cobbett was one of the things he did in his newspaper was he would get on his horse and he would go out on a ride in the countryside and he would record everything he saw. And then when he got home, he would write it up as a column in his newspaper called A Rural Ride. And so Cobbett had ridden all over Southern England and the places where I was walking, but he'd done it 200 years before me. So I had Cobbett's book and it was very interesting to read his account of what he was seeing. And then I would walk through the same landscape and find, surprisingly, not that much had changed. So it was quite interesting. Anyway, he's sort of one of my, and all of those columns, I should point out, were published later in a book form, and it's called Rural Rides in 1830. And it was a very popular book, and still, historians still read it today because it gives you a really clear picture of what England was like just at the time that the Industrial Revolution was taking off. Some more pictures of the walk, just to give you more of a picture of what it was like. So really pretty water meadows near Farnham. This is just outside of Compton. There was a famous Victorian artist called George Frederick Watts, and he lived in a house here with his wife, Mary, who was also an artist. In the village of Compton, the graveyard had become really crowded, and they decided they needed to open up a new graveyard. So they bought some land just outside of the village, just near the Watts house, actually, and decided this will become the new graveyard. So the Watts approached the village council and said, "We'd like to build you a chapel for the new graveyard." And that's the chapel you can see on the right. It's called the Watts Mortuary Chapel today. And what makes it different, besides the fact that the architecture is really unusual, is that Mary was a believer in the arts and crafts movement. So she believed people's lives could be improved by teaching them to do different arts and crafts. So she went to town council and said, "We'll not only build you this chapel and pay for it, I will train local people to do the work." So she trained people to become painters, sculptors. They did all these terracotta tiles on the outside, and the paintings on the inside, which you can see on the left there. And it's really a beautiful building, and it's worth a visit. It's sort of Art Nouveau, but in a Celtic kind of flavor. And it was one of the more interesting things I saw on the walk. Just another picture along the route. This is St. Martha's Chapel. No, this is St. Catherine's Chapel here, just near Guildford. And it drops down into a valley there where you have to cross the river, and then you go up that hill on the far side, and St. Martha's Chapel is sitting up there. So on a good day when it's not pouring rain, you can actually see the two chapels. This one's in ruins, but St. Martha's still in good kip. So more of the scenery along the way. Just another cart tracks through a farm which had once been the Pilgrim's Way many years ago. I threw this slide in too because it was another interesting church I passed. This is called the Apostles' Chapel. It's just outside of the village of Albury, and it has a really interesting history because it was meant to be the center for a new Christian sect called the Catholic Apostolic Church that started in the late Victorian period. It was led by a renegade Presbyterian minister named Edward Irving, and they believed in things like the second coming of Christ was coming very soon. They believed in bodily rapture, so that the idea that you could be lifted up to heaven as you are now, speaking in tongues, faith healing. It was very much an evangelical sect, but the core of their belief was they believed that the second coming was coming very soon. So the leaders of the church were called the 12 Apostles, and they were people that were appointed from the lay people to govern the church. But because they thought the end of times was coming very soon, they never had any kind of succession plan. So as these people died off, there became fewer and fewer apostles. There are still some followers of the church today, but the day I walked by, it was all locked up and nobody was there. So I just thought it was an interesting sort of commentary on religion and how things come and go, and you know, they were so firm in their beliefs at the time that this was going to happen, but then it didn't. And how would you feel if you were a devout follower and then nothing happened? What would you then do? I don't know. Those were the kind of questions I was asking myself, but it was really quite a beautiful church. Here's another church. This is in the village of Shear, and it's St. James. And actually, if you watch the movie, I think it's Bridget Jones' Wedding, it was filmed in this church, so you probably have a picture in your mind of what it looked like. But the interesting thing that happened here was in 1329, there was a young woman named Christine Carpenter, and she petitioned the Bishop of Winchester, and she said, "I'd like to become an anchorite." So her idea was she would build a cell against the outside wall of the church, and she would live there the rest of her life in prayer and meditation. And so they agreed. And so the cell was built, and you can see the outline of it on the wall on the left there. They've torn it down years ago, but you can still see where it was. And then she basically was locked in that cell, and she communicated to the world through these two holes that were carved inside on the wall of the church. So they've been blocked up now, but you can see there was a trefoil window there where she could receive communion. And then there's a slanting opening there, which is called a squint, so that when she was sitting in her cell, she could see the altar and she could watch the priest perform the mass. And yeah, so she stayed there most of her life. The interesting thing about this story is at one point she escaped, and then she came back and she asked the bishop to let her go back in the cell. And he agreed after some negotiation. And so she spent the rest of her life in there, but then it was torn down after she died. But it's not very big. If I was to stand against that wall, my shoulders would be about where the roof is. And there's no way I could have lain down in it straight. So it was a very cramped, damp. It would have been freezing in the winter and boiling hot in the summer. So you just have to admire her persistence. And here's some more recent history along the way. During the Second World War, a whole series of pillboxes were built along the North Downs, along this chalk ridge, some 28,000 actually, and they were meant to be a last line of defense for the city of London if the Germans crossed the Channel. Fortunately, they were never used, and about 1,000 of them still stand today, and some of them, like this one, were open, and you can go inside and have a look. A nicer day, it's not raining. This is Box Hill. I'm looking across the valley of the River Mole, and that hill on the far side is called Box Hill. It's owned by the National Trust, and it's kind of a popular day trip destination for people in the area to go for a picnic or for a hike. And if you've read Emma by Jane Austen, there's a very important scene in that book that's set on top of Box Hill. The characters have a picnic here. But you can see that it's a nice south-facing slope. It's very warm. They're actually growing grapes here. So I would cross the river here on these stepping stones, climb Box Hill, and that was the view from the top of Box Hill. And I threw this slide in to sort of give you a picture of what it's like. So you tend to walk high up on the ridge during the day, but there are no villages up there. So at night, when you need to find a place to sleep, you go down the hill and you go and stay in the nearest village. In this case, this is the town of Dorking, one of the bigger centers. Like, a lot of the villages were quite small, but this one was bigger. And that's where I stayed for that night. So it just kind of gives you an idea. You walk high, sleep low. This was just past Dorking. The next day, I walked past this. It's called the Town Hall of Gatton. So Gatton Park was a notorious rotten borough in the early 1800s. And a rotten borough was a riding in Parliament where there were only a few voters. So in Gatton Park, there were actually only 7 people eligible to vote, but they returned 2 people to Parliament at each election. William Cobbett, as you can imagine, was furious about this because he was a reformer and he thought there's no way this should be allowed. And he called for the whole system to be abolished. And in 1832, British Parliament passed the Reform Act, and all of these rotten boroughs were taken care of. But so this is a monument to, I don't know, corruption, I guess you could say, because every time there was an election, 7 people would meet here by this urn and vote to return 2 people to Parliament. I apologize for the quality of this slide, but it was taken on a cell phone, but I did want to include it in my show because I thought this was really interesting. So this is taken from the Church of St. Peter and St. Paul in Chaldon, a very small little village. And just I check my notes here. I want to make sure I get the date right. In 1869, they were doing renovations on the church, and the workers started chipping away the plaster at the back of the church, and they realized that under the layer of whitewash and plaster was this old mural, this medieval mural. And so they decided to go at it very carefully and peel it all off and try and preserve as much of it as they could. And it is the best preserved 13th century doom mural in existence. And a doom mural is a picture of what happens to us after we die. So this wasn't quite on the path, but I'd read about it in a magazine and I was so interested that I really wanted to see it. So I did a mile detour up to the north of the path and just to see it. So the picture, as I said, is what happens to you after you die. So in the top left-hand corner, you can see St. Peter weighing the souls of the dead. And presumably, if you weigh the proper amount, you get to climb the ladder and go up to heaven. You can see the angel directing some people up the ladder. And if you fail, you go down the ladder to hell. And so in the lower level is hell, and you can see the devils and the imps, and they're all prodding the damned, and they're all being tortured in one way or another for their sins. And on the right-hand side, you can see there's a tree, which is the tree from the Garden of Eden. And if you look carefully in the top of the tree, you can see the serpent there. The most puzzling part of the picture to me was the top right-hand corner, because I couldn't figure out what quite was going on there. There's a devil laying on his back and somebody spearing him in the mouth with a crucifix. And then all these little creatures rising up out of the flames, holding their arms up in the air. So I did a bit of research, and one historian, or many historians, have come to the conclusion that this is a depiction of the harrowing of hell. So one of the problems that medieval theologians had was, if Jesus came to earth to redeem us of our sins so that we could go to heaven, what happened to all the people that were born, lived, and died before Jesus came to earth? So their solution to this problem was something they called the harrowing of hell. So when Jesus was crucified, he went down to hell, and then he brought all the good souls back with him. So this is a depiction of that act. So Jesus is defeating Satan, releasing all of the good souls from hell that had lived in sort of classic times. Anyway, that was, to me, this whole picture was very fascinating because it just represented a whole different mindset to what we have today. I mean, if you think about it, the message it was giving people was that what you do in your life matters. The choices you do matter. So think about them carefully. This is the village of Godstone. I threw it in here because I just wanted to give you an idea of the sort of places that I slept at night. In many of the villages, I stayed in the pub or a small inn. So this is an inn in Godstone. I believe it was built about the time of Elizabeth I. So some of them were quite old. So and it had lots of character. Just some more pictures along the way. The picture on the left is called a holloway. If a road has been in place for many hundreds of years, what it tends to do in England, because there's so much rain and the ground is so soft, is that it tends to start to sink down into the ground. So this path that I'm on here is bounded in by hedges on both sides, which have grown over the top to form kind of a tunnel. But the actual surrounding fields are at about my shoulder height. So over the years, because so many people and so many cattle and things have walked down this path, it's actually sunk into the ground. So this in England is called a holloway, because it's kind of like this almost subterranean passage that you start walking through. The picture on the right is just for fun. It's a tombstone in a graveyard in Godstone. And if you look carefully, you can see there's a skull and crossbones on it. And it is supposed to be the grave of a very notorious pirate called Edward Trenchman, who was killed there and buried in that graveyard. This is the village of Wrotham. And I threw this in because there's an interesting story here too. If you see that the church tower has kind of a tunnel carved through it. And this is very unusual, but it was just so that the sidewalk didn't have to go down at the road level, and pedestrians could pass right through the church tunnel on their way to the village green. Inside the tunnel is this stone, which has lots of grooves cut in it. And local historians believe that this was the place that archers came when they were on their way to the village green to practice, where they would stop to sharpen their arrowheads. So for me, I mean, this is fascinating, because you think, some medieval archer stopped here to sharpen his arrowheads. He may have accompanied Henry V to Agincourt, but this is where he practiced. So little things like this tend to make history come to life. I'm now in the valley of the Medway, so a little over halfway through my walk. The Medway Valley is the broadest valley that I'll have to cross. And here's where the Medway River cuts through the North Downs on its way to the sea. The Medway is also the largest concentration of Neolithic ruins in Britain. And what we're looking at here is called the Coldrum Stones. And originally it was a burial mound. So there would have been these upright stones in a circle with capstones on top, and then the whole thing was covered in earth, and the bodies were buried in the center chamber. But over the centuries, the earth has eroded away, the stones have been exposed, local people have come and hauled the stones away for building projects, and this is what remains. So there's a rough stone circle now that remains, and there's another circle like this a bit to the right. There's actually two a bit to the right, and there's another one across the valley, which is called Kit's Cody House, which is maybe a little more famous than this one, which you see lots of postcards of. So it was really interesting. But where I'll be walking in a day's time is on the ridge on the far side of the valley. So I have to go up the valley, cross the river, and come back down on my way to Canterbury. Just a little village I walked through that day that I thought the houses were really pretty, so I threw that in there. And this is how I would cross the River Medway. This is not the way the medieval pilgrims would have crossed. There was a ferry here that they could have taken. But today there's something called the Medway Viaduct, which is a very modern structure. And it's actually 3 bridges side by side by side, 2 of them for car traffic. And the one closest to us is for train. And it's the route for the train from London to the Channel Tunnel. So it zips along here. But I had to cross this to get to Rochester. And here's Rochester. Rochester is a sizable town on the Medway, close to the sea. So it's a port city. People can sail up this far to unload boats. It was also the lowest bridgeable point on the Medway. So the Romans discovered this. They built a bridge here, and they built a garrison to guard the bridge. And where the Roman garrison was in the medieval times, this castle was erected. This castle was erected at the time of William the Conqueror. And if you look at it, you probably think, well, that looks familiar. That's because the architect of this castle was the same man who built the Tower of London. So he used the same sort of building plan. He also built the cathedral that you see on the right, which is Rochester Cathedral. Rochester was a really interesting town. It had a lot of Dickens associations, and every year they have a Dickens festival. Charles Dickens' father worked at the Chatham shipyards, which are just down the river from Rochester. They're the Royal Navy shipyards. He was an accountant there. Dickens, when he retired, moved to a house in a little town called Gad's Hill, which is just outside of Rochester. And a lot of his characters inhabit Kent. We're in the county of Kent now. And the year I was there, they were celebrating the novel David Copperfield, as you can see. And in the novel David Copperfield, young David Copperfield actually walks along this road. He crosses the river here. He walks along the main street on his way to Canterbury. So he and I will be following a bit the same path. Inside the cathedral, there's this really interesting painting that you can see on the left. So it's a depiction of the Wheel of Fortune, and it was painted about the same time that Geoffrey Chaucer was writing his book, Canterbury Tales. So they're kind of coexistent. Part of it is missing because in the Reformation, a lot of these church paintings were painted over, like the Doom mural we saw earlier. They would have all been covered up. But this half of the painting was preserved because there was a big pulpit pushed up against the wall here, and it sort of covered it. So this is what remains. So it's an interesting view into the medieval mind. So it's a depiction of our life and how our fortune can be circular. So the woman standing in the center is the Greek goddess of fortune, and she's turning the spokes on a wheel. And as you can see at the bottom, there's a poor man trying to climb up. Halfway up on the left is a yeoman, so like a rich farmer. He's doing better in life. And at the top, they're sitting quite comfortably a very rich man. And if we could see the rest of the painting, it would have been the rich man falling from power and becoming a poor man again. So it was this circular pattern of people's life. And it was a warning not to be too proud or not to be too complacent, because your fortune can always change. And one of the tales in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is the Monk's Tale, which is a whole series of these Wheel of Fortune type stories, and to the point where the other people listening to him say, okay, enough. We've heard it 16 tales of woe. That's enough for one day. Thank you very much. And they shut him up. But so I often wondered if Chaucer might have seen this picture when the paint was still wet, and that's what inspired him to write the tale. And this is the river across the Medway here in Rochester. So you can see that's where the Romans built their first bridge. Then the medieval would have rebuilt the bridge. And then in Victorian times, this more modern bridge was rebuilt. And this is taken from the top of Rochester Castle. And you can see the main street. And it's interesting to think that Roman legionaries marched here on their way to London. Chaucer's pilgrims coming from London to Canterbury would have passed down the other way. Young David Copperfield in the book crossed this bridge on his way to Canterbury as well in the story. And I just noticed after I was doing this show for another group that right in the middle of this picture is a submarine. So you can see just down the river, it's still Royal Navy dockyards. I threw these in, again, more just pictures along the way. The one on the left struck me as one of the most interesting things I saw in my walk. I was crossing a sheep pasture, and you go from one style to the next, and the path was a solid path of daisies. These are small English daisies. It's the only place they grew. They didn't grow in the grass on either side. They just grew where people were walking. So for me, I just thought, isn't that a strange thing? But I guess people walking are carrying the seeds along on their boots, and it's just getting planted that way. On the right is all that remains of Boxley Abbey. Boxley Abbey was a large monastic establishment, which would have been a place where pilgrims stopped coming from London on their way to Canterbury to stay overnight. So this was the Great Hall. It's where the meals were served and where the pilgrims could bed down on the floor when they were staying overnight. Today it's a barn in somebody's farm, but it's still there. Another picture of the trip. You can see there's a lot of the Pilgrim's Way goes through private land now, but there's still a public right of way. So there's a lot of gates you have to close and a lot of stiles you have to walk over. This one's kind of interesting because we're looking across the valley of the Medway from the other side now. And kind of in the top middle of the picture, it's hard to see, but is Leeds Castle. So that's on the other side of the river. And we're getting very close to Canterbury now. Just a tiny village, and it was very pretty, so I threw it in. It was kind of place that this is Hollingbourne, and they had gorgeous gardens here. And that's me. The only picture of me on the trip, I asked somebody else to take a picture of me here. That's Brother Percival, the carved statue on the bench. And if my backpack wasn't in the way, there's a carving on the back of the bench that says, "Pilgrim bound with staff and faith, rest thy bones." So there's some good Samaritan put this bench here for tired people walking the route. Oh, I mentioned earlier that I would keep bumping into Jane Austen. This is another Jane Austen association. I mentioned that her brother Edward inherited the estates of a very wealthy family that he was related to. This is his other estate. This is Godmersham Park, very close to Canterbury. And as you can see, it's quite a beautiful country house. Jane Austen was a frequent visitor here. We know from the letters that she wrote. She was very fond of her nephews and nieces, her brother's children. So she made frequent visits here. And I suspect if you're a Jane Austen fan and you've read many of the books where there's big country houses and balls and gatherings and stuff, that this was the inspiration for a lot of that. Today, although it's now a college for opticians, so you can't visit. This is Bigbury Hill. And you can see that somebody's been going through cutting down all the brush. And it's for an archaeological dig because many years ago, this was an Iron Age hill fort. So in the shadow of the trees, you can see there's a ditch. And inside that ditch, there would have been a wooden palisade, and that would have been the fort on the top of the hill. This was the site of a very famous battle. In 54 BC, Julius Caesar, with his legions, defeated the local British chieftains on this hill. So it was his first big pitched battle when he invaded Britain, and he won easily. And it was all downhill from the Britons from there, and the beginning of the Roman period of occupation in Britain. And there's Canterbury. So if you were a pilgrim in Chaucer's day, this is Harble Down that I'm standing at. It's a little village up on the hill. This would have been your first view of the Cathedral of Canterbury. And I imagine quite moving because you would have walked for several days and you'd be quite tired, and then you'd get to the top of this hill and look out, and that's what you'd see. And just some shots of Canterbury. In the Second World War, Canterbury was actually hit quite hard during the Blitz. About a quarter of the town was flattened. But fortunately, the part of town around the cathedral was mostly spared. So the areas around the cathedral look pretty much as they would have looked to the medieval pilgrims. A lot of the streets look the same. This is the West Gate. So it was Canterbury at that time would have been a walled city. This is where the pilgrims would have come in on their way to the cathedral. The gate's still there. On the left are some houses that were built by Huguenot weavers. The Huguenots were French Protestants who left France for England for greater religious freedom. And they were weavers, and they set up here along this canal. This is where they wove fabrics that they sold. And on the right is the old Pilgrim's Hospital. So if you were a poor pilgrim to Canterbury, this is probably where you would have stayed. It was a big hall. There would have been a meal and a place to sleep on the floor. Today, it's where they have chamber concerts and stuff like that, but it's still the old Pilgrim's Hospital building. Here's some of the back streets going up towards the cathedral. You can see they still have a very kind of medieval flavor. And as you're walking down these streets, you'll go through a big gate called the Butter Gate. And as you walk through, this is what you see. You can see the big cathedral for the first time, and it really is quite beautiful and quite impressive. And the cathedral, as I mentioned earlier, is the head of the Anglican Church worldwide. So this is the seat of the present Archbishop of Canterbury, who's the head of the worldwide Anglican Church. And pilgrims do still come here, so they still have blessings of pilgrims. There's still pilgrim services. Pilgrims are welcome to come and join the service, and there's a service every day of the week. Now, the shrine that used to exist in Canterbury for St. Thomas Becket is no longer there. Henry VIII, during the Reformation, had all of these things removed. A lot of the monastic lands were seized and redistributed. So what they've done today in modern times is they built this little altar to mark the place where Thomas Becket was killed. I won't go into all the details because, sorry, I talk about that a lot in my book, but to put it in a nutshell, Henry II, when he came to power, he was a little worried about how powerful the church had become in England. And so when the seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury became vacant, he had this great idea. He was going to lobby to have his friend Thomas Becket become the next Archbishop of Canterbury. So Henry thought, with Thomas in power, then we can do some reforms because he's my friend. He'll agree with what I have to say. But the opposite happened when Thomas Becket, who had been Henry's great friend and right-hand man, became the Archbishop of Canterbury. Suddenly he became very religious. And he said to Henry, "I'm sorry, Henry, the church doesn't answer to the King of England. It answers to the Pope in Rome." And so they got into this loggerheads and they were arguing over everything. And there was a feast when Henry was in France, and he said out loud, he said, "Oh, who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" And 4 knights who were at the feast thought, okay, we're going to get in good with Henry. We're going to go to Canterbury. We're going to arrest Thomas Becket and bring him back for judgment to the king. Unfortunately, because arresting an archbishop is a kind of dangerous thing to do, they had a lot to drink. So by the time they got there, and it was late December when they arrived, it was a dark night. It was evensong, and they got into this very undignified wrestling match with Thomas Becket, and in the end, one of the knights swung his sword and chopped the top of Thomas Becket's head off, basically. And then they thought, well, that's it, and they killed him, and they ran away because they thought, what have we done? So this is the place Becket was martyred, and shortly after his martyrdom, people started to come and visit. Pilgrims started to come and visit, and they started to witness miracles. So it became one of the more popular pilgrimage shrines. But as I said, the original shrine is long gone, but this is quite a nice little memorial to that event. And this is my last slide. It's in the basement of Canterbury Cathedral, and it's kind of where I end my book. So I'm going to, again, just read a passage from the book and just sort of finish it off. I end my tour in the 11th century crypt, the oldest part of the cathedral, and pause in St. Gabriel's Chapel, which houses some of the oldest wall paintings to survive in England. There is no one around, so I take a seat. My eye is drawn to a 12th century depiction of the scene where the infant John the Baptist is given his name. In the picture, the baby is lying in the arms of his mother, Elizabeth, while his father, Zechariah, struck dumb in wonder. Both parents were very old when John was born, so his birth was viewed as a miracle. Writes the name of his infant son on a piece of parchment. It is a moment that makes me think again of my own father. Fatherhood and the feelings of wonder and joy that come from being a parent are something we both share with Zechariah. My greatest happiness in life is in my children. I hope my father felt the same. So I thought that was an appropriate point to end the book because I've been doing the pilgrimage for my father, and as I'm walking, I was thinking a lot about the relationship that we shared. And so that's where I'm going to end my talk as well.
Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. And that was just so lovely.